What makes this story difficult to tell is that neither man ever gave us permission to tell it. They didn't leave behind manifestos, they didn't explain themselves in memoirs, and when journalists pressed for clarity, both men instinctively deflected, not out of secrecy, but out of discomfort, because explaining restraint always sounds like justification, and neither man believes strength needed defending. Maurice Gibb understood something early that most artists never do. That talent alone doesn't keep people together. Someone has to absorb the emotional fallout when things go wrong. Someone has to be steady when everyone else is volatile, and that role rarely comes with credit. Inside the Bee Gees, there were long stretches when nothing felt stable. Creative disagreements lingered longer than they should have. Silences lasted days, sometimes weeks, and when those moments happened, Maurice didn't escalate them. He didn't force resolution. He waited. That waiting, that patience, shaped everything that followed. But it also trained people to overlook him. Paul Newman lived with a similar contradiction. The more successful he became, the more carefully he reduced his presence. That didn't make sense to people around him. Success usually invites expansion, more roles, more exposure, more explanation. But Newman seemed to contract instead, and that raised questions no one quite knew how to ask. Was he tired? Was he disillusioned? Or was he protecting something no one else could see? The truth sat quietly beneath all of those guesses, and no one was listening closely enough to hear it. There's a reason restraint unsettles people, because it forces everyone else to confront their own noise. Maurice Gibb never spoke over his brothers, but his silence often made their arguments louder. Paul Newman never competed for attention, but his refusal to play that game made others look desperate by comparison. Neither man intended this effect, but they understood it, and they accepted the cost. There were moments when Maurice was alone in rooms that used to feel full, moments when the music still worked, but the connection didn't. Those moments are rarely described in detail, they're brushed past, because lingering there forces an uncomfortable realization that some people keep things alive without ever being seen doing it, and when they step back, even briefly, the absence is immediate. Maurice never pointed that out. He didn't have to. Paul Newman faced that same paradox later in life. People noticed when he stopped appearing. They noticed when he declined opportunities, but they didn't understand what they were actually losing. They thought they were losing a star. What they were losing was a stabilizing presence. Someone who didn't inflame situations. Someone who didn't demand more than was necessary. Someone who understood when enough was enough. That kind of presence doesn't announce itself. It simply vanishes. What connects Maurice Gibb and Paul Newman isn't tragedy, it's discipline. Both men lived through moments when self-destruction would have been easier, more accepted, more expected, and yet both chose the harder path, the quieter one. Not because it looked noble, but because it worked, and because it protected the people around them. Here's where the story becomes more personal and more uncomfortable, because restraint doesn't just shape public life, it reshapes private relationships. Maurice wasn't just holding together a band, he was holding together a family, and that kind of responsibility leaves marks no one sees. Paul Newman wasn't just stepping back from Hollywood, he was stepping towards something smaller, something more fragile, and more real. But neither man explained those choices, they simply lived them. People often confuse silence with avoidance, but these men weren't avoiding anything, they were confronting it privately, and that distinction matters. Because private confrontation doesn't leave evidence. No quotes, no footage, no moments to replay, just outcomes. And outcomes are rarely dramatic enough for history books. There were conversations Maurice never repeated, moments he never described, decisions he made without consensus, not because he wanted control, but because someone had to choose stability over satisfaction. That responsibility weighed on him. People close to him noticed it, but Maurice never articulated it. He carried it. Paul Newman did the same. There were offers he turned down quietly, projects he walked away from without explanation. He never framed those decisions as moral stands. He didn't want admiration for restraint, because admiration changes behavior, and he was guarding something more important than image. The strange thing is, both men succeeded wildly anyway. Maurice's work continues to define generations. Paul Newman's legacy expanded far beyond film, and yet neither man seemed fully comfortable with how history remembered them. Not because it was unfair, but because it was incomplete. There's a moment late in Maurice Gibb's life where someone asked him gently if he ever felt overlooked. The question lingered longer than expected, and his response, brief, understated, avoided the question entirely. That avoidance wasn't accidental, it was intentional, because answering honestly would have required explaining something he never wanted public, something he believed would lose meaning if spoken aloud. Paul Newman had a similar moment. Someone close to him once suggested he deserved more recognition for what he had given away. He didn't respond immediately, and when he did, he changed the subject. That silence said more than any answer could have, but it also left something unresolved. And that unresolved space is where this story truly lives. Because strength that isn't acknowledged doesn't disappear. It accumulates, it settles, and eventually, it demands recognition, not through applause, but through absence. There is one specific choice each man made, a choice so quiet it barely registered at the time, a choice that didn't look heroic, didn't look generous, didn't look significant, but that choice explains everything about who they were and why their absence felt heavier than anyone expected. We're close to it now, but not yet, because understanding that moment requires understanding what they gave up and what they protected and why applause was never the point. The moment itself didn't look important. There were no cameras rushing forward, no dramatic pause, no reaction from the room. It was just a choice, and that's why it was missed. Maurice Gibb made his choice in a way only someone deeply disciplined could, not in public, not through explanation, but through consistency. People close to him would later say the same thing, that after a certain point, Maurice became steady, not euphoric, not preachy, not transformed in the way people expect, just steady, and that unsettled them. Because the world understands collapse, it understands confession. What it doesn't understand is someone who changes and never asks to be witnessed doing it. Maurice never reframed his life as a redemption story. He didn't narrate his recovery. He didn't use it to reposition himself inside the band. In fact, if anything, he became quieter, more observant, as if he understood something fragile had been preserved and didn't want to disturb it. That fragility mattered more than recognition. Paul Newman's defining choice looked different, but it came from the same place. By the time his charitable work reached a scale most people couldn't comprehend, advisors encouraged him to take ownership, to attach his name more aggressively, to step into the spotlight he had earned. Newman refused. Not politely, firmly, and when pressed for a reason, he gave none, because explaining it would have turned the act into something else, something performative, something that belonged to the audience, not to the people it was meant to help. This is where the story finally sharpens, because both men understood the same uncomfortable truth, that applause changes intention, that once strength is celebrated, it begins to serve the celebration, not the purpose. Maurice Gibb didn't want his sobriety to become part of the Bee Gees' mythology. Paul Newman didn't want generosity to become part of his legend. They wanted those things to remain functional, quiet, effective. There's a strange loneliness that comes with that choice, because people don't know how to respond to unadvertised strength. They don't know when to say thank you, or if they're even supposed to. So they move on, and the person holding everything together becomes invisible. In Maurice's case, that invisibility was familiar. He had lived with it for decades, but something changed after he stabilized himself. People relied on him more, emotionally, structurally, without ever saying so. When tensions rose, Maurice was expected to absorb them. When conflicts stalled, he was expected to wait them out. That expectation was never discussed. It simply became reality, and Maurice accepted it. Paul Newman experienced the same phenomenon in reverse. As he withdrew from visibility, people leaned on him differently, not for opinions, not for leadership, but for steadiness, for the sense that someone in the room wasn't trying to win, someone wasn't posturing, someone knew when to stop. That presence mattered more than fame ever could. Neither man described this role, but both men lived it, and both men paid for it quietly, because restraint doesn't replenish itself. It draws from something finite. The cost only becomes visible in hindsight, in Maurice's tired smiles, in Paul's narrowing circle, in the way both men avoided language that centered themselves. They were protecting something, and protecting something always means losing something else. When Maurice Gibb passed away, the shock wasn't just grief, it was disorientation. The Bee Gees didn't just lose a brother, they lost an internal gravity, something that had been holding them in place. People spoke about him in fragments, his humor, his musicianship, his kindness, but no one could quite articulate the full weight of what was gone, because no one had ever named it while he was alive. Paul Newman's absence felt similar. Hollywood didn't mourn loudly. There were tributes, statements, ceremonies, but underneath all of it was a quieter realization that something grounding had vanished. Someone who didn't escalate, someone who didn't exploit, someone who understood that not every moment needs amplification. This is where the applause should have been, but it came too late, and it came in the wrong language. Because you can't applaud restraint retroactively, you can only feel the emptiness it leaves behind. The truth is, Maurice Gibb and Paul Newman were never trying to be admired. They were trying to be useful, and usefulness doesn't photograph well. It doesn't quote cleanly. It doesn't trend, but it holds systems together. Families, bands, institutions. There is something deeply countercultural about that kind of strength, especially in industries built on spectacle, because it refuses to collapse for entertainment. It refuses to confess for engagement. It refuses to turn pain into product. Maurice Gibb could have been louder. Paul Newman could have been bigger. Both men chose not to be, and in doing so they preserved something rare: integrity without performance. The moment we started this story with the quiet decision no one noticed wasn't dramatic. It didn't signal change. It didn't ask for understanding. It simply marked the point where each man decided what kind of strength he would live with and what kind he would refuse. That's why their stories linger, not because they shock, but because they unsettle. They ask an uncomfortable question: what kind of strength are we rewarding, and what kind are we ignoring? Maurice Gibb and Paul Newman didn't need applause, but we needed them, and only after they were gone did that become clear. Their legacy isn't noise, it's balance. It's the feeling that something solid once existed and now doesn't. And if this story stayed with you, it's because some part of you recognizes that strength. Even if you've never seen it applauded, Maurice Gibb and Paul Newman, strength no one applauded. There's something unsettling about realizing a person mattered more than you understood, not because they demanded attention, but because they never did. That realization doesn't arrive all at once. It creeps in quietly during moments when something feels off, but no one can explain why. People often say Maurice Gibb was underrated. That word doesn't quite fit. Underrated implies comparison. Maurice wasn't competing. He wasn't waiting to be discovered. He was doing something else entirely. He was maintaining equilibrium, and equilibrium only becomes visible when it disappears. In the years after Maurice was gone, people began rewatching old footage, not searching for virtuosity, not even nostalgia. They were searching for something harder to name: a look, a pause, a presence that had once made tension feel manageable. They didn't find a single moment. They found a pattern. Maurice stepping back, Maurice listening, Maurice diffusing. It had been there the whole time, just never labeled. Paul Newman's legacy followed a similar path. At first, people talked about his films, then his philanthropy, then his restraint. But even then, something remained unspoken, because restraint sounds passive, and Newman was anything but passive. He was intentional, and intention without spectacle confuses people. There's a reason these stories feel heavier as time passes. Because we live in a culture that rewards exposure, confession, visibility, public processing. Maurice and Paul offered none of that. They processed privately, they resolved quietly, and they moved forward without asking permission. That kind of maturity doesn't translate well into headlines. What rarely gets discussed is how difficult that choice actually is. Because choosing silence doesn't end the noise, it absorbs it. Maurice absorbed the tension of brotherhood. Paul absorbed the pressure of expectation. Both men understood that if they released that pressure outward, it would fracture something fragile. So they held it, and holding something for a long time changes you. There's an emotional cost to being the steady one. People don't check on you. They assume you're fine. They assume strength is self-sustaining. Maurice rarely spoke about exhaustion. Paul almost never did, but traces of it exist, in moments where their energy softened, in moments where they chose distance over explanation. Those weren't withdrawals, they were acts of preservation. What makes their stories linger isn't tragedy, it's recognition, because almost everyone knows someone like this. The person who keeps things running, the one who smooths over conflict, the one who doesn't complain. And usually, that person is thanked last, if at all. Maurice Gibb didn't want to be remembered as the strong one. Paul Newman didn't want to be remembered as the good one. They wanted something simpler, to leave things intact. And in both cases, they succeeded. But success without applause creates a strange afterimage. People sense it, but can't quite articulate it. This is why their absence felt disproportionate, not explosive, just destabilizing, as if a weight had been removed and everything shifted slightly out of alignment. Not enough to collapse, enough to notice. There's a quiet irony here. The men who avoided myth became the ones people now mythologize, not because they chased it, but because their restraint stands in such sharp contrast to everything around us. In a world that performs vulnerability, they practiced it privately. In a world that monetizes pain, they absorbed it silently. The strength no one applauded wasn't dramatic, it wasn't cinematic, it didn't arrive with music, it arrived in choices no one realized were being made, day after day, year after year. And that's the part that stays with people, not the songs, not the films, but the realization that someone was holding the center and never asked for credit. Maurice Gibb and Paul Newman didn't leave behind chaos. They didn't leave behind scandal. They left behind absence, and absence is harder to process than loss, because it asks a question with no easy answer. What was keeping everything together before? If this story lingers, if it feels heavier the longer you sit with it, that's not nostalgia. That's recognition of a kind of strength we rarely name and almost never celebrate until it's gone.